Good morning, friends. So I couldn't help myself. We're going to talk today about the goodness of God's law, and we're going to do that by looking at a portion of the law itself and seeing it in action. So let's go back to Leviticus 19, only this time we'll read verses 26 to 31. God commands, "You shall not eat any flesh with the blood in it. You shall not interpret omens or tell fortunes. You shall not round off the hair on your temples or mar the edges of your beard. You shall not make any cuts on your body for the dead or tattoo yourself. I am the Lord. Do not profane your daughter by making her a prostitute, lest the land fall into prostitution and the land become full of depravity. You shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am the Lord. Do not turn to mediums or necromancers. Do not seek them out, and so make yourselves unclean by them. I am the Lord your God." Okay, so there are a lot of different regulations recorded here, and at first they seem somewhat disjointed, I grant you, but I chose this passage first because there is an underlying principle that connects these rules, and when it comes to modern day application of the law, the essence is in the principles. And secondly, because this is one of those passages that critics try to use as a gotcha against Christians who take the view that I'm sharing with you, and we'll get to that in a minute. Because as we read this, we immediately see some regulations where we are like, absolutely, we should never do that. Then there's some things that we might be a bit iffy on, not sure why that's such a bad thing. And then there's other things that we're like, what, why not? And this is where that understanding of a passage's context will lead us to the undergirding principle we need to understand. And in this case, what we need to understand is the historical context, because these laws were given to govern the people on how to live as they enter the promised land, the land of Canaan. And the thing is that there were already people in that land that were pagans. They worshipped false gods, and they had practices like selling their daughters into prostitution that were absolutely detestable and reprehensible to the Lord. And God is essentially saying, do not be like them, not even in surface external ways, which is what brings us to the gotcha moment, because some detractors look at verse 27, which we just read, and they say, ha, you guys who think the law applies today are just a bunch of hypocrites, because this says you can't trim your hair or your beards, but you don't obey that, do you? But the response to that is that God always made it clear that the individual rules and regulations, some of which are culturally bound, were trying to describe the purpose and point of the law as a whole and in general. It's a principle. Again, we can see this with the Pharisees of Jesus' own time. What did Jesus rail against them for? Because they would do the letter of the law while totally ignoring the point of the law. And so when I say that we ought to pay attention to the law of God, even today, that's what I'm driving at. The law of God reveals the character of God, as we talked about yesterday, and it describes the principles by which we can live in agreement with his character, in agreement with who he is, so that our character can match his character. And so in this case, when God says that he is holy, there is none other like him, he also calls us to be holy. And that means that being holy, we need to be separate from the rest of the world. And in this passage of Leviticus, everything from cutting their hair a certain way, and it is a certain way, so it's not just cutting your hair in general, but it's cutting your hair a certain way, and that certain way was a hallmark of the pagan priesthood of the land that they were going to go into. The religious elite did their hair this certain way. God's saying, don't do that. He said, everything from that to eating the blood of animals, to consulting with mediums and necromancers, to, yes, forcing their daughters into prostitution. Those were all regular practices of the pagan nations who were at enmity with God in the land of Canaan. So the question is, involving the principle, how could it possibly be a good thing for God's people to align themselves in any way with the enemies of God rather than with God himself? The perfect example from this passage, from these examples of the various rules, is the issue of mediums, or in other words, psychics. Now, there is sufficient evidence, at least for me, to believe that these people, psychics meaning, at least when they're not just straight up tricksters and con men to begin with, but those who actually have some measure of power, are actually communicating with demons. Check out the verses I put on the screen for more information on that. But whether they are demons or simply communicating with the dead, how can we possibly go to them seeking particular knowledge or information when we claim that the sovereign God of all knowledge is our Father? As James says, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach. In other words, God is not going to yell at you for not knowing something and coming to him to find the answer. And with the same truth in mind, Isaiah asks, should not a people inquire of their God? Should they inquire of the dead on behalf of the living? And Isaiah asks this kind of incredulously. That just doesn't make any sense. We go to God. So you see, the law of God is designed to lead us away from that which will harm us and toward that which will give us life and light, namely God himself. Because at best, the dead, in this particular situation, the dead cannot help us except to serve as a massive distraction from the one who actually can help us, and that's a detriment. And in my opinion, again, far more likely, the demons contacted in this way will actively seek to deceive people however they can to keep them from the truth of God. So how could we possibly align ourselves with those kind of things rather than God himself? And the law of God also deals with far less esoteric matters. Continue reading in this same chapter of Leviticus 19, and you'll see regulations that require people to respect the age and experience of older folks, to be kind and generous to strangers, to deal their business fairly and not swindle other people. And yet the prevailing opinion of so many people is that the law of God is somehow oppressive and irrelevant and unnecessary. How is the law of God, which serves to protect us from our own self-destructive tendencies, which tells us to love other people enough to respect them, to be kind to them, and to be fair with them, how can that be considered oppressive or irrelevant? I honestly don't get it, friends. Except that maybe some people will rail against any law because all they see is the law. They see the restriction itself, rather than the inherent benefit of submitting to that restriction. In any case, I hope in some small way this very simple and not even close to exhaustive treatment of these few verses will help us each to see that God's law, while certainly incapable of saving us, because we need the righteousness of Christ for that, but that God's law is still good, in that it reflects the character of God, and the rules and regulations in God's law are in and of themselves beneficial. That is, as a hypothetical, if a society would follow the principles of God's word, even if they didn't believe in God, that those principles are so inherently good that the society would still benefit, because they're God's principles, whether a person understands that or not. That's how good God's law is. So as we wrap up this work week, just a little something to let spiritually percolate in your mind over the weekend. Have a good and godly day, and if the Lord wills, I'll see you tomorrow.